Welcome to the Center for Jewish Studies. I'm Michael Rosenthal, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. But before I kind of give a little bit more formal introduction, we should begin with the land acknowledgement, traditionally now at the University of Toronto, and that we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're also lucky today to have Professor Marci here to lecture us as part of a conference that I and Inon Wagoda have organized on modern philosophical readings of the Book of Job. And so if you're curious, we had a great day of discussions today. We'll have another set of lectures tomorrow, and anyone who becomes particularly curious is welcome to join us. The program is online. But let's turn to our lecture today. Marci Shore is professor of history at Yale University and a regular visiting fellow at the Institute for Wissenschaften und Menschen in Vienna. Her research focuses on the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She's the translator of Michal Głowiński's The Black Seasons, and she's the author of several books, one of which, Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, which I'll mention in a second again, and a new edition of her third book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, is forthcoming, I guess right now. I don't know. You tell me whether it's come out yet. So a few days ago, so congratulations. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. When we thought about whom to invite for the conference, in particular for the part of the conference that also serves as the CJS public lecture and as part of the CJS collaborative program grad seminar, Inon and I both thought that Professor Shore would be ideal for several reasons. I've read, for example, her book Caviar and Ashes, which discusses the long history of Jewish intellectuals, particularly literary figures in Poland, who adopted and then struggled with Marxism. What I found remarkable about this book, which I highly recommend to you, is her ability to do several things. First, to contextualize these figures, to explain where they're coming from. They belong to a very different particular place and time. Second, to sympathize with them, right, which I think was really quite an achievement, which is particularly difficult because in hindsight, we can see the kind of flawed conclusions that these intellectuals came to. And it would be easy, as she points out in introduction, and we can know, if you know, other historians condemn these figures for their own errors. And so her sympathy that she produces is important because we can see that we could easily condemn them. And third, to somehow bring these figures that seem to come from a really different place and time, to bring them into dialogue, even indirectly, with our own situation as living thinkers who teach us not just what happened, but perhaps something about what we ought to do as well. And it's not surprising that given her talents in each of these respects, especially the last of these qualities, that Professor Shore has become a noted public intellectual. She writes not just for strictly academic audiences, but also for a wider public, and is published in reviews and newspapers in Germany, Poland, the Ukraine, and of course the United States. And she told me she was on a radio interview already earlier today, talking about things that are going on in the Ukraine. The title of her talk today is Hegel or Job, Reading Lev Shestov in Wartime Kyiv. Like in her previous work, she discusses a thinker, Shestov, who really isn't that well known today, who's difficult due to the particular literary and philosophical context in which he wrote, which it seems very remote and different from our own, and a figure who wrote in a place in Eastern Europe that we don't fully understand, right? Many of us don't, and has become yet again a place absolutely central to world politics. I think that we can rely on Professor Shore as a guide to the intellectual and political translation of Shestov, like these other remote and apparently difficult thinkers that she's previously engaged and brought to life in her books. We're lucky to have such a distinguished historian and intellectual to help us both to understand the past in the particular figure of Shestov and to bring them all back to life by showing us the difference from our time, but also the relevance it might have to us. Please join me in welcoming Marci Shore.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much to Michael and Yanan for inviting me. It's been a pleasure also to listen to people talk about philosophy. I'm a complete interloper at this conference. I have no expertise in biblical interpretation whatsoever. But when I got the invitation, it was kind of hard to resist, in particular because it was a chance to talk about Shestov, and Shestov is largely forgotten at the moment. I've long had a preoccupation with him, and now I particularly have a preoccupation with him for reasons I will go into shortly. And he was someone who, among other things, was preoccupied with Kierkegaard's reading of Job, which was the connection here. So hopefully everyone has this little handout that I made. There are even some pictures. I don't normally send around pictures of myself when I give a lecture. That's not my thing at all. But I just got back from a trip to Kiev, and my wonderful colleague, the publisher Leonid Finberg, took me to the house where Shestov lived, and so it was kind of irresistible then to give you guys a little picture. So I came to Shestov in a kind of strange way. He is a Jewish philosopher from Tsarist Kiev. He was born in 1866. I came to him through an interest in phenomenology. He was a very important interlocutor for Edmund Husserl, which I'll talk about in a bit. And in particular, well, one of the things that years ago caught my attention about him is that Husserl is he's a very compelling figure in a lot of ways, but he's also a very dry figure. He was a terrible writer. He kind of brackets his own biography. There's very little biographical information on him that's particularly vivid. I mean, they're all this huge literature on, Freud, Marx, Kafka, self-hating Jews, struggling with existential identity questions. None of that on Husserl. He was just a philosopher. And the most interesting writing that has ever been done about Husserl, the person, was done by Shestov right after Husserl's death. And that memoir, that eulogy to Husserl, that was by far the best text that's ever been written about Husserl. And it was one of the things that helped me understand Husserl the most. So that's how I came to Shestov. And then I increasingly developed an affinity for him. He's a character in a larger book project, which is a long, now for the better part of 2 decades going on book project, which if these world historical catastrophes would stop, I'd be able to finish, which has to do with encounters among thinkers connected to phenomenology from the late 19th century through the 20th century in East Central Europe. And when one of my graduate students was in a seminar, I made my poor graduate students read a draft of the first 6 or 7 chapters of the manuscript. And Lola said, "You're so in love with him. It's just obvious that you're so in love with him." And I thought, yeah, each book, there's a character in every book that we write, I think, that we become particularly attached to. In my first book, it was Alexander Vatt, which if anyone reads the book, they will notice. And in this book, it's really Shestov. He's my favorite. I feel particularly affinity for him. But he's also there because not only because he's an interesting thinker, but he's the most deeply decent of any of them. I mean, there's really a kind of Menschlichkeit that comes through with Shestov that I cling to these days, especially. He was also, and I'll get back to this at the end when we talk about Kierkegaard, a deeply dialogical thinker. That in an era in which there was a lot of, in Russian they would say kto kavo, a lot of who's on top, who's on the bottom. Shestov was always talking in dialogue, both with the living and with the dead. He liked to think with people. He liked to think with people he disagreed with. He was very warm and generous about that. His sister, Fana, who becomes a Freudian psychoanalyst, found it obvious that in all her brother's choices were motivated by a kind of lifelong Oedipal rebellion against their Orthodox father, who is the patriarch of a textile business, beginning with Shestov's decision to reject the family surname as a literary pseudonym, Shestov, and she accuses him of being a neurotic who is full of angst. In all his dialogues with Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, he's always writing about these other neurotics, and he's self-absorbed, and it's an attempt of self-analysis. And all that might be true, but it doesn't, the self-absorption and neurosis doesn't make him ungenerous. He's extremely generous and extremely empathetic towards his interlocutors and very, very kind. And really, in some ways, the one who most maintains his humanity of all the many varied characters in this book. So that was how I originally came to Shestov. And then I feel as if I've come to him again, or I've come to him with a kind of deeper layer as I've, watched Kiev, well, intensely for the past 10 years, but really intensely for the past 2 years. And I probably don't have to explain, why that's happening. He loved Kiev. He was a very cosmopolitan thinker. He comes from this religious Jewish family in Kiev. He's back and forth between Kiev and Moscow as a student. He also studies in Berlin. He lives in Switzerland. He lives in Paris. He's functioning in a whole bunch of different languages. He's very cosmopolitan, but he also really, really loves Kiev and is constantly drawn back to Kiev. And around 1908, when he is visiting there, and he's back and forth for a long time, also because he marries a Russian Orthodox woman and he doesn't want his parents to find out about it for a while. So he's in this weird way, like splitting his ear between, living with him in Switzerland part of the time and going back to Kiev. And then his parents, for health reasons, also are like they relocate to Germany, but sometimes his mother comes back. And in 1908, he writes to his father about the mother's visit to Kiev while he's there. And he says, if you and Mama were to live in Kiev, everything would be splendid. Mama immediately became 10 years younger here. It would be exactly the same with you. To this moment, I still can't believe that Mama is here. And every time I think of that, my heart leaps from joy. So there is just this very, despite the very difficult relations with his family, there's this very warm attachment to Kiev. And, at a moment when that city has, for me, become kind of the capital of the free world and the most intellectually intense place to be, which is why even terribly cowardly people like me are heading out there under the shelling. It makes me feel particularly close to him. And in fact, when I was going to Kiev, I wanted to do a seminar at the Kiev School of Economics on Shestov, and my friend, the philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko, said we can't do a seminar just on Shestov because he's too Russian. And this is a moment where there's a lot of canceling of Russians. And that's a whole other topic, which I'm happy to talk about later. I think there's a desire to introduce a kind of ontological difference, a kind of a sense of stability that kind of mirrors or mimics an ontological difference between good and evil at a very extreme moment. So Volodya and his brilliant wife, Tanya Ogarkova, who's also a philosopher, and I decided we were going to do a public talk on grenzerfahrungen, on Grenzsituation, and talk about a lot of different thinkers on these border experiences. And it was then, once Volodya started talking about Shestov, that I realized I had misinterpreted his Shestov as too Russian, because he was rethinking it through. What Volodya was reacting to is, but Shestov was an irrationalist, and here we're grappling with this whole irrationalist Russian philosophical tradition, and that's why Tanya and I went to study in Paris, because what we need is more Cartesianism. What we need is more rationality. What we need is more of a realm of reason, and so I had, early in my studies, I had rejected Shestov as being part of this world of an embrace, a kind of decadent embrace of irrationalism that was connected with the Slavophiles. And he said, but now that we're talking about him, I'm rethinking that. And so I then push back against that. I want to kind of defend Shestov from this reading of being part of the Russian irrationalist tradition, which of course, in many ways he is. And of course, it's something that's coming under scrutiny now. There are all these famous lines in Russian poetry, like Russia cannot be understood with the mind, Russia is something in which you just must simply believe. And at a moment where we're facing wild irrationalism, where, you have this, tyrannical dictator running a neo-totalitarian regime who is just bleeding through his whole population and all his resources, slaughtering people for absolutely no reason, it's understandable you might feel a rebellion against irrationalism, which I'll talk about a bit later. But I want pushing back a little bit against this, and kind of inspired by this long conversation that Volodya and Tanya and I had 10 days ago at the Kiev School of Economics. I want to talk about Shestov's preoccupations, this idea of the possibility or impossibility of reaching truth, of finding certainty. And what is the relationship between certainty and truth? Is certainty and truth the same thing? I mean, for Husserl, it was absolute truth and epistemological clarity. We're very, very close. And Shestov is going to try to disentangle that. He's going to ask questions about the limits of reason. He's going to ask questions about why should contingent factual truths be eternal? Why did something that happened but did not have to happen, that was not a priori? Why is there no statute of limitations on that? Why is the fact that, you know, Socrates was poisoned, that did not have to happen? It might have happened otherwise. It's a contingent truth, a factual truth, an empirical truth. Why does it then get validity forever after? Like, why is there no statute of limitations? And perhaps most importantly, in the context of Job, he has a preoccupation with the relationship between the singular and the universal, you know, and he's fixating on this term in Russian. I gave you guys some code words on the handout with my little gloss from the Russian, and one of them is something that he gets from Dostoevsky, I think, semstvo, this kind of allness or everyoneness, you know, or generalness. I think maybe allness, all of us, the kind of the generality against the individual. That is part of his struggle against the universal is part of his struggle against necessity, and part of his claim to freedom. Okay, let me give you, because I'm not really a philosopher, I'm an intellectual historian, so I'm going to give you some historical biographical stuff. Shestov was born, he was born, very deeply in Tsar's times, mid-19th century, 1866. As a young person, he had revolutionary inclinations in a rather humanist way. He was on the left, but not a Bolshevik. He was back and forth between Kiev and Moscow, in part because he would get himself in trouble in one place through hanging around with quasi-revolutionary student circles, as all the students did, and then he would go to the other place, and this was very common. You'd go back and forth trying to get out of being punished for any of these things. He studies math and law. He's very interested in the poverty of the peasantry and the conditions for factory workers. There aren't very many factory workers at the time, but the ones who are there are not doing very well, and peasantry is massively impoverished. He writes a doctoral thesis about Tsarist legislation regarding the working class, which is censored in Moscow. But he doesn't really want to practice law anymore. So in some sense, that doesn't matter to him that much. He goes back to Kiev. He works with his father in his textile firm, which he can't stand, but he feels obliged. And the working out of the relationship with his father is another big theme. He has an affair with a young woman who is employed by the family. And there's a child, a son, then born out of wedlock, whose name is Sergei Listopadov, who's born in 1892. And I'm mentioning the son because although Shestov is not the one who raises him, he's very important to Shestov. And that relationship is going to be important as well during the First World War. So he will come back into our story. When he begins to write, he adopts the Russian pseudonym Lev Shestov. In 1897 in Rome, he meets a Russian Orthodox medical student named Anna, who he marries. They very soon afterwards have 2 daughters, and he is afraid to tell his father because she's not a Jew and the father would never accept her. And so he's shuttling back and forth between Switzerland and Kiev. And, it's pre-airplane travel, pre-internet. It's not such an easy thing to pull off, but he pulls it off for quite a number of years. And in the meantime, when he's in Kiev, he's working with the father's textile business and trying to save the money to fund Anna's medical education. So I have to say, this is one of the things that also warms my heart towards him, because he was, before his time, he was extremely supportive of his wife's career and her education. Even though textile trade is just odd to him in its banality, and he writes to Anna, he's like, I'm used to feeling either elated or crying. And it's a strange feeling to find myself in a situation where there's never a reason either for great joy or for great suffering. You just kind of do business. You just kind of go about it. And at the same time, he is thinking about philosophy and doing a lot of reading. And, his concern is, what is the relationship between what is universally valid and what is particular? How do you get from the singular to the universal, from the particular to the general? And in his 1905 book, The Apotheosis of Groundlessness, he says that the study of history should teach us that there is no such thing as infallible ideas or eternal laws, that we tend to treat as natural things that happen just because they happen, when in fact they might all have happened otherwise. And that would have seemed just as natural. So how then can we disentangle the accidental from the inevitable? And what is more essential? What happens inevitably, what needs to happen, what is a priori true, or what is contingently accidentally true? And he's very sensitive to our human fear of uncertainty. He says, we're clutching at dogmas. We want universal rules. We want things that always obtain. But that's not what life is. And that's not what the task of philosophy should be, because philosophy's task should be not to provide certainty, but to teach man to live in the uncertainty that is our true condition. So we're constantly going back to this theme of there being no certainty, there being no grounding. And I've given you a couple quotes in the handout that I especially like. One of this from Apotheosis of Groundlessness is, men respond only faintly to the horrors that take place around them, except at moments when the flagrant, savage incongruity and repulsiveness of our condition suddenly presents itself before our eyes with irresistible lucidity and compels us to look at ourselves. Then the ground slides away from under our feet. And his empathy for this groundlessness was, you can say it was self-absorbed because he's very concerned with his own feelings, but he's also constantly responding to other people reaching out to him. And one of them is a young Russian Jewish philosophy student named Aaron Steinberg, who gets in touch with Shestov when he's studying in Germany, and Shestov is in Germany around 1911, and Steinberg is just 20 years old. And Shestov actually gets on the train and goes to Heidelberg to visit this young guy. And Steinberg meets him at the train station, and he takes him to this restaurant and then explains that unfortunately he can't Steinberg can't actually eat anything at the restaurant because he keeps kosher, and he can't eat at a restaurant. And so Shestov, who'd been reading the menu, takes his gray blue eyes and looks at the young man and puts his hand on his elbow, and he says, "Do you know who would really love to meet you? My father." My father would immediately find common ground with you. I can't agree, because in contrast to Feuerbach and all the materialists, I think that a person is not what he eats. And this only really works in Russian. So for those of you who know Russian, человек не ест то, что он ест, because the word for есть is like to be and to eat are here the same. And then he says, "You aren't a Marxist, are you?" And Steinberg says no. And then he's like, how do you jump right from kosher food to Marxism like that? And then they start to talk in Russian about German philosophy. And then Shestov tells him, what's healthy for the Germans is fatal for the Russians, which is one of his favorite things. Что немцев здорово русским смерть. And I mention this as well because Isaiah Berlin has this whole kind of theory of Russian intellectual history in which everything was okay until you import Hegel. And Hegel may have been okay for the Germans. The Germans could handle him, but you give a little Hegel to the Russians and they're drunk, they're gone, it's over. If you know Alexander Herzen's memoirs, he talks about phenomenology of spirit, and he says it's not a book that you read, it's an experience. You live through the phenomenology of spirit. And so, yeah, Shestov is there's going to be a lot of struggle against Hegel. Okay, so that was Aaron Steinberg. I'm going to mention another thinker who is a kind of mentee of his, not as young as Steinberg, but older, but younger than Shestov, and that's Gustav Spiet, who was born in 1879, who is another philosopher from Kiev. And Spiet goes to Göttingen. So they know each other from Kiev, and then Spiet goes to Göttingen to study with Husserl. And Shestov is very excited because he's been reading Husserl and he's obsessed with Husserl, and now kind of here's his chance to hear about him almost firsthand, kind of secondhand. And Spiet really believes in the phenomenological method. he really believes that, Husserl's idea that you can reach epistemological certainty and absolute truth this way is true. And that's why he is schlepping out to Göttingen in this kind of pilgrimage that people who are the yes, we can people are doing at the time. And Shestov is passionately interested in Husserl, but does not follow him in the conviction that this method can actually bring us to certainty. And so in a letter in July 1914, Shestov writes to Spiet, please ask Husserl, what does he himself, for himself, really think about the anxieties that Dostoevsky expresses? If the occasion arises, he says, ask him what he thinks about Nietzsche, about Ibsen. Perhaps in that way, we'll finally lay our fingers on the key to his intuition. What is it he needs it for? What is it Husserl needs it for? Is it to save Wissenschaft or to open the path to what can humanly be attained? And then Spiet writes to his lover, who at that time is pregnant with a child, Natalia, and urges her to read Shestov's books. And he says, I consider them exceptionally remarkable. On the other hand, he's difficult to understand, not because his writing is difficult, but because in a peculiar manner, he draws negative conclusions, which most people understand as skepticism and pessimism. And meanwhile, I don't know anyone who is searching harder for or is more desirous of finding truth than he. So this is right on the eve of the First World War. And Shestov is in Western Europe at the time. He's in Switzerland. He's not in Kiev during the Bilis trial, when Bilis is being tried for ritual murder in 1913, but he can't calm down. He feels something like he's caught up in the story of the Bilis trial. And then in August 1914, when the First World War starts, he decides that with his wife and daughters, they're going to go back to the Russian Empire, which is not necessarily like a logical move you make. But he makes this, and it's not that easy to get from Switzerland at that time back to the Russian Empire, but he decides to do it. And they do. They get there, and they're going to spend the war between Moscow and Kiev. And he's writing to his sister, another sister who stays in Switzerland, late in 1914, once they've arrived in Moscow. He says, the events are so monumental that it's impossible to fathom their inner meaning now. And he added, it will be impossible to afterwards. In Moscow, he reconnects with his son, with Sergei Listopadov, who he's very close to at that time, and who is always visiting and hanging out with his father and his philosopher friends when he's back in Moscow, but is also sometimes at the front, and goes through various injuries and comes back and recovers and then goes back. And at the same time, Shestov remains, in Moscow during World War I, his son fighting the Germans, completely captivated by Husserl. And Husserl's sons are fighting on the other side, although they're not on the Eastern Front, they're on the Western Front, they're fighting the French. And it seems to him more and more, to Shestov, that Husserl's promise of absolute truth was for mankind what the promised land was for the Jews. And in the midst of all this, in 1916, 1917, in the midst of the First World War, he writes this essay, polemicizing with Husserl's phenomenology called Memento Mori. Like, we should remember that we are mortal, remember that we will die. And it's impassioned attack on Husserl's epistemological utopianism. And it's the kind of attack that is made both with great love and could only have been made by somebody with profound empathy for the temptation, that temptation towards epistemological utopianism. And he writes there, he says, Husserl desires no compromises. It's all or nothing. Evidence, this idea that Husserl has of, which alternately gets translated into English as self-evidence, or it's not great in German or in English, but like direct correspondence between what you see and what is given and what is there, this, inner evidence, absolute evidence. Either evidence is the final destination towards which the human spirit strives as it seeks truth, and this evidence is reachable by human beings, or a kingdom of chaos and madness is to reign on earth. And Shestov has all possible respect for Husserl's understanding that the stakes are all or nothing. And he agrees that, he writes, it's time at last to lay all the cards on the table and raise the questions as radically as Husserl did. And one of the things that's interesting, a little footnote, Heidegger thinks that in order to think philosophically, you have to think in German, and that if the French, even if they try to think about something serious, have to switch to German. Shestov here is critiquing Husserl's German phenomenology conceived in German in Russian, and in two ways, I think it becomes much clearer in Russian than it is in German. One of which is evidence, which I think is just not a great word either in German or in English. He translates into Russian as ochevidnost. And ochevidnost is literally visibility to the eye. The quality of the visibility to the eye, which is exactly what Husserl has in mind. All Husserl's metaphors are visual, and they don't have that word in German, but they have it in Russian. And so what's very actually murky in German becomes very clear in Russian. And he also takes, and this changes the whole conversation. In German, you've got the word for truth, Wahrheit, like in English. And in Russian, as in Ukrainian, by the way, there are two words. There's pravda and there's istina. And so you can actually disentangle two different kinds of truth. And there's a whole history of how these two words for truth get used in different ways, but probably most significant for this particular conversation is istina has this, absolute, a priori, uncountable, connected to religion, beyond the empirical feeling, whereas pravda tends to get used more towards an empirical truth, factual truths that can be countable. But you can disentangle these things in Russian, where you can't in German, or you can't in English for that matter. Okay. So he says in this piece, Memento Mori, in contrast to the rationalist philosophers, it's necessary to say that philosophy does not begin when man arrives at an incontrovertible criterion of truth, of istina. On the contrary, philosophy begins when man loses all criterion of truth, of istina. And that the real mysteries at the heart of human existence come in that dark space, and perhaps Husserl was just kind of postponing those questions for a later day, like lots of busy people. And then he goes into a critique of reason. He says Husserl is one of those people who he wants to say that reason can do it. The Obama, yes, we can guy. Obviously, Obama wasn't around at that time, but that Husserl is remaining in these middle zones of life where reason can reach. And this is where Husserl distinguishes between, and he gets at something that Karl Jaspers will later call the Grenzsituation, the limit situation, the boundary situation. And he says, we must have the courage to tell ourselves firmly, the middle zones of human and universal life resemble neither the equator nor the poles. Rationalism's ever-repeating error is the certainty of the limitless power of reason, der Schrankenlosigkeit der objektiven Vernunft. Reason has done so much, therefore reason can do everything. But much does not mean everything. Much is separated from everything, to colo, like much and everything are absolutely incommensurate. They belong to two distinct, irreducible categories. And this idea that reason is fine most of the time when we're in this realm of the everyday. But then there are these boundary zones, these boundary experiences, and that's where reason can't reach. In the meantime, Spiet, who he's been incredibly generous towards, then goes on the attack against him and has these notes in his diary about how horrible he is and how the fact that he doesn't like reason, it's out of a weakness for reason and it's because he's a loser, and that he's not really looking for truth, he's really looking for God, he's just not being honest about it with himself. And then Spiet publishes this text called The Skeptic and His Soul, which is really a kind of characterological attack on Shestov, but he doesn't use his name. And he's saying skepticism has no standing as a theory. It's not a principle. It's just this kind of cowardice and abstaining from judgment. It's not even nihilism. It's not even radical negation. It's just abstinence from judgment, which betrays a weak character. And then Spiet turns to Hegel and says the skeptic was one who, as Hegel says, kann nicht zur positiven Philosophie gebracht werden, who can't be used for positive philosophy. And Spiet is saying that there are two kinds of philosophers, positive and negative. Husserl is positive. He's bringing us something. All Spiet is doing, all Shestov is doing is saying that, I'm not sure. I don't think this can work, blah, blah, blah. And then he says Hegel understood skepticism as a stage. Spiet is saying Hegel understood skepticism as a stage in the development of consciousness, which then gets absorbed and dialectically sublated through the dialectical progression of philosophy. And Spiet disagrees. He says skepticism is outside of dialectical progression. It's undialectical. At a minimum, it's adialectical. It's outside the movement of history. And it equates simply to a failure to take responsibility. It's a form of intellectual cowardice. And it's just like being a lover who is jealous of other people's success, and it's the psychology of a loser who feels himself rejected by truth. And so like a spurned lover says, oh, she wasn't that beautiful anyway. That capricious truth could not be so beautiful. In the spring of 1917, you have the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicates. Nobody knows what's going to happen. There's a vacuum of power. Sergei Listopadov is killed at the front, which is one of the most crushing things for Shestov, the death of his son. The Bolshevik Revolution comes. It gets harder and harder to live in Moscow. In February 1918, the Red Army takes Kiev. For those of you who haven't tried to get your mind around Kiev in 1918 and 1919, it's completely crazy because just in 1 year alone, it's occupied by 5 different armies and changes hands dozens of times. It's completely nuts. February 1918, the Red Army takes Kiev. March 1918, the Germans capture Kiev and they install Pavlo Skoropadsky as this hetmanate under German control. And it's in the wake of that Shestov and his family leave Moscow for. They get there in July. In November, the Hetmanites fall and the Germans abandon the city. If you want to commune with this moment, Bulgakov's novel, White Guard, is basically like 48 hours precisely at this moment. Then Simon Petlora's Ukrainian nationalist forces come and take Kiev and establish Ukrainian People's Republic, and then, 6 weeks later or something, February 1919, the Red Army comes back. And the Bolsheviks like Shestov, even though he's not a Bolshevik, but they consider him a revolutionary philosopher. They feel like he's a revolutionary. He just doesn't know he's really a Bolshevik yet. So if we kind of encourage him and give him the right conditions, he'll come around to us in the end, and all he needs to do is direct his talents to the revolution. So he's allowed to teach at the university. He gives a course on Greek philosophy. He gives another course on fundamental philosophical problems from Plato to Descartes. And they keep hoping that he's going to, devote himself to the revolution any moment now. In the meantime, Shestov is more than aware that his situation is very precarious. Every time he's walking to the university, he takes these very indirect routes through side streets and tries to avoid running into people. In the meantime, like a very good Jewish son, he's writing letters to his mother in Western Europe saying, we're all fine. It's great. Everything is trouble-free with us. Don't worry. Kids are flourishing. It's okay. Family has been spared any brutality. And at the same time, he's writing to Spiet saying, by now, everyone or most people have physically and morally surrendered. In early September 1919, the White Army takes Kiev. And then suddenly, the shops are empty and the family doesn't have enough to eat. His daughters, Tatiana and Natasha, are working in the countryside for peasants who are paying them in food. There's money, but the money no longer really has any value. The city is full of blood. There are pogroms. Shestov's daughters did not look obviously Jewish. They're dressing as Russian girls. They're living in this small dacha on the outskirts of Kiev. And one day a Cossack appears at the dacha searching for Jews. And his daughter Tanya goes out into the porch. And the Cossack asks her very politely, "Здесь жидов у вас нет? Do you have any kikes here?" And Tanya's like, no. And he's like, the Cossack is then very apologetic. He says, I just asked because we've been ordered to slaughter all the Jews. And then he bows to her and taps his horse with his whip and rides away. And at that point, Shestov's like, okay, we've got to get out of here. And so they make this harrowing trip. He gets a priest who it's friendly with to give him a document stating that he is on the mission for the whites, and so doesn't have to show his passport saying that he's a Jew. It takes the family 3 weeks to reach Yalta from Kiev. Then they make this kind of horrendous journey from Kiev through Kharkov to Rostov in freight cars, and then from Rostov to Yalta by boat, then to Sevastopol, also in Crimea, then to Sevastopol to Constantinople by French steamer, from Constantinople by American boat to Genoa, then to Paris, then to Geneva, and they survive, but it's quite harrowing. And when he gets back to Western Europe, everyone wants to know one thing: what is going on in Russia? And he's like, it's outside the realm of what can possibly be described. How could anybody possibly understand that people were annihilating themselves? That some thought they were carrying out a great deed, the salvation of humanity. Some were not thinking at all. They were simply adapting to the moment in which they found themselves. What will happen tomorrow is all the same to them, Shestov writes in 1920 when he gets to Switzerland. They don't believe in tomorrow, just like they don't remember what happened yesterday. And he thinks this is most of the people in Russia. And he's writing about Bolshevism in this essay, which I feel like should undergo revival. I really wanted to teach it this semester, but I don't think it exists in English translation. It's Что такое русский Bolshevism? What is this thing, Russian Bolshevism? And it's very interesting, especially looking back. And he says, Russians have never liked the word citizen. They prefer to think of themselves as objects rather than as subjects. And the Bolsheviks hadn't yet even realized that they were doing exactly the opposite of what they'd wanted to do and what they claimed to do. They betrayed the people who should have been made to be citizens with their own subjectivity and instilled with the consciousness that they were not slaves, but people within possession of rights that they were obliged to defend. Instead, he says the Bolsheviks talked about freedom only until they had power, and then freedom became their most despised words. They were not good Hegelians. They believed in nothing other than brute physical force. In the depths of the nation's soul, he said, there had always been faith in Pravda. Now the Bolsheviks were carrying out precisely the opposite. And the brutality that was happening, he said, was outside the realm of what could be expressed. He then goes on to turn to Dostoevsky the next year, writing in memory of Dostoevsky on his 100th birthday. He's long not been alive. And how Dostoevsky understood that certainty was not truth. And he positions Dostoevsky against Kant, and in fact, his tribute to Dostoevsky is a critique of Kant, in whose mind metaphysics, insofar as it wanted to exist, Shestov claims, had to first ask natural science and mathematics for its blessing. And the critique implicitly pertained to Husserl as well, to the whole of the whole epistemological tradition. And Shestov understood philosophers had always longed for the absolute, that thing that would guarantee us, that insight that would guarantee us the truth that was timeless, that was eternal and non-contingent. And yet this absolute, he says, what Dostoevsky understood, this absolute was equivalent to tyranny. And this was what the Grand Inquisitor had understood, that people feared freedom above all, that they longed for the infallible authority before whom they could all bow down. And he looks at Dostoevsky's rebellion against the general and the universal, that which obtained for everyone in favor of the individual. All notions of common sense implied the general, not the particular. And this everyone-ness, this tsemstvo, that was Dostoevsky's great enemy. And here is where Dostoevsky clashed with Kant, for whom experience was essentially universal. Experience was the collective experience of humankind, and consciousness was really general consciousness. There was something generic about it, in that knowledge only becomes knowledge insofar as we discover some kind of pure principle that's always and everywhere going to obtain. And what Dostoevsky understood is that in order to get to truth, you had to give up this attempt to get to some kind of general law. For Istina was above laws. That people searched for these foundations, what would always obtain, but there was none. And that philosophy had always considered itself obliged to justify itself before this tsemstvo, before this everyone-ness, before this Bewusstsein überhaupt, this consciousness in general, that it sought this kind of universal grounding. But life was outside of that, and God was outside of it. He's always kind of flirting with God, and for him, God is going to be pure proizvol, which is really pure caprice. And произвол is a word I'm also kind of obsessed with in Russian because we don't quite have it in English. And it's been something that, Russian liberals have revolted against, for at least, 2 centuries now. And it's caprice, it's arbitrariness, but it has the sense of potentially tinged with tyranny. The sense that you're an object, not a subject, and the powers that be can do what they want with you. So God is pure произvol. God can do what he wants. God doesn't have to offer justification. God demanded only the impossible. Okay. So here, Shestov says that, Kant claims to write the Critique of Pure Reason, but it's really Dostoevsky who writes the radical critique of pure reason. And what Kant wrote was not a critique of reason, but an apology for reason. Finally, then, after that, in the late 1920s, Shestov gets to meet Husserl, who he's now been polemicizing, with at least since 1916, 1917, and really before that. And they meet for the first time in Amsterdam in 1928, and they love each other. And this is going to become one of the most important relationships for both of them at the end of their lives. And it's a story I find extremely moving, and not because either one of them is dissimulating, precisely the opposite. They each recognize in the other someone for whom these questions were all consuming with their whole being. And Husserl then explains to Shestov how he felt, as a young professor lecturing in front of the class and then realizing that there was no solid foundation for anything, and how can I even stand up here and talk to these students when we have no grounding for anything? And then that's when I decided I was going to start over, do the Cartesian experiment from the very beginning and build everything from a solid foundation. And Shestov was very moved by this. He understood that it was a kind of Kierkegaardian either or. And just Husserl's wife, Malvina, was like, they're like two lovers, inseparable. He comes over and they don't leave. They're still talking about philosophy all through the night and the next day. And it is at Husserl's house that Shestov meets Heidegger. And Shestov had already read Being in Time. And it's very interesting because you would read Being in Time, you think these ideas and this preoccupation with authenticity and with the Sein zum Tode and with mortality and with death is much closer to Shestov than Husserl's epistemology. But he doesn't hit it off with Heidegger. In fact, he's kind of skeptical. And after Heidegger leaves Husserl's house, Husserl turns to Shestov and says, you have to read Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard will help you understand where Heidegger's coming from. And yes, Heidegger is hard to get to know. And then Shestov falls in love with Kierkegaard. And it, of course, is very ironic that it was precisely Husserl, who is the least Kierkegaardian person, who can't stand that whole tradition in philosophy, who generously points him towards Kierkegaard. And then at that point, Shestov's sister Fana, the Freudian psychoanalyst, says to Steinberg, what did he write about? It's always these neurotics. It's another neurotic. We had Nietzsche, we had Dostoevsky, now we've got Kierkegaard. This is all just kind of an attempt at self-analysis, and then the aunt, who studied philosophy in Switzerland says well, your brother's his main problem is that he turns away from Kant. It's the rejection of Kant. This is how he ends up as erotic. And the sister, the psychoanalyst, is okay, this is totally absurd. And she says to Aaron Steinberg, she says, if a person exhibits boundless narcissism and self-absorption and at the same time is extremely insecure and feels surrounded by enemies, then no Kant is going to help. But it's Kierkegaard, in any case, who then brings Shestov in these last years of his life into this intense dialogue with Job, because he becomes preoccupied then with Kierkegaard's reading of Job. And as I said before, Shestov is a very deeply dialogical thinker. And he's caught up as well in what everyone's struggling against Hegel. This is like the Russian thing. You're working out your relationship to Hegel. This is also a German thing, but they're doing it in a different way. Nietzsche's in revolt against Hegel. Kierkegaard's in revolt against Hegel. Dostoevsky kind of can't make up his mind and is tearing his hair out. And what strikes Shestov about Kierkegaard's revolt against Hegel was Kierkegaard turns from Hegel to Job. And how is it that you go from the great German scholar to this totally private thinker, this guy, this Job of the Bible, and that Kierkegaard throws himself at Job as if at salvation, as if to his only savior? And Shestov says, Job restores to the weeping and the cursing rejected by speculative philosophy their primordial right, the right to come forward as judges when inquiries are begun into the whereabouts of truth and falsehood. The greatness of Job for Kierkegaard, is that his suffering cannot be allayed by these empty promises. And I think I gave you this next passage on the handout. Shestov writes, to leave Hegel for Job, he's writing now about Kierkegaard. If Hegel could have admitted even momentarily that such a thing is possible, that the truth is not in him, but in the ignorant Job, that the method of inquiry into the truth lies not in a search for the self-movement of the concept discovered by Hegel, but in wails of despair, from which Hegel's point of view are wild and meaningless, then Hegel would have to confess that his whole life's work and he himself amounted to nothing. And what Shestov saw that Kierkegaard saw in Job was this withdrawal from the everyone, from the general, from the universal, in favor of the particular. To look at in the validation of the individual experience, the withdrawal from the general. On whose side is truth, Shestov's asking? On the side of everybody, or on the side of the individual who has dared to look madness and death in the face? Job's friends are saying that men and gods alike must accept their fate. And Job is at some point saying no force is strong enough to make him accept it. Neither the rightness or justness of his fate nor his power. Why is the ethical associated with the acceptance of necessity? And this goes back to Kierkegaard's and then Shestov's idea that for Hegel, the ethical is all about the universal. This was his obsession with Abraham and the binding of Isaac too. This was Hegel's problem with Antigone, that you put the individual above the universal. And he said the problem of, for Hegel, you're always elevating the universal. And you connect the singular and the universal, and you get to the ethical through this kind of dialectical progression. And for Shestov, no, like the singular and the universal cannot be dialectically synthesized that way. And why should the ethical be the universal? Job suspends the ethical. There's a suspension of the ethical that Kierkegaard sees in him. And for Kierkegaard, Job's greatness is not that he accepts that the Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away, but that he gets to a point that he despairs that his grief is heavier than the sands of the sea. So this assertion of the singular against Hegel, that cannot be synthesized or dialectically merged. This is what he takes, and this is what he finds life affirming. In Kierkegaard's reading. And it's part, this rebellion against the allness is part of the rebellion against necessity, against these universal laws, which he considers to be oppression. All metaphysical systems, not only Hegel's, Shestov says, begin with freedom and end with necessity. Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Shestov says, they all spoke effusively of freedom, but when they found themselves face to face with freedom, they were terrified. What was Hegel's Besinnung other than a kind of look thrown backwards, a glance thrown backwards, which made everything that already happened appear determinate? Hegel's Owl of Minerva was essentially a deceiver, attempting to instill in us this feeling that in the end, necessity and freedom were one and the same thing, but Shestov refused to be fooled. No amount of metaphysics could change the fact that necessity was necessity and not freedom. And his flirtation with God then has to do with the fact that for God, there's no necessity. For God, the impossible does not exist. God was in some sense this alternative to reason, but God was capricious and reason was a tyrant. And so you were always kind of in between Athens and Jerusalem in that sense. Satisfied with nothing other than the universal and the necessary, reason behaved like a tyrant. It demanded the sacrifice of everything in order that it may obtain the necessity, which is so dear to its heart. He's a very sarcastic, kind of aphoristic writer. To Shestov, it was obvious, he writes, reason must servilely reproduce what is given to it. This is Husserlian Gegebenheit, what is given to us. It must produce what is given to it, and it reproaches as the greatest of crimes every attempt at free creation. As for us human beings, we in turn must servilely obey all that reason dictates to us. And this is what is called freedom. Truth, he says, must be sought precisely where Husserl did not search for it, not in light and transparency, not in certainty, but in darkness. Okay, I'm going to say just a few things in conclusion. Now I realize I'm babbling a lot about Shestov because you guys have given me the chance to talk about Shestov and most people aren't interested. That is Shestov's last book, Athens and Jerusalem, which he completes in 1937. Precisely at that moment, as he's completing that book, his friend Gustav Spiet is in Siberia, giving a statement to the NKVD that since his exile during the Stalinist terror to Siberia on accusations of having betrayed the revolution, he has translated nothing apart from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In fact, this is what he does while in Siberian exiles. He translates Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. That's June 1937. On October 27th, 1937, in Tomsk in Siberia, Spiet is again arrested and forced to give a false confession to having been recruited into a counter-revolutionary monarchist organization. He is sentenced to death and executed a few days later. Shestov had read Husserl for the first time around 1908, before the First World War. They met in person only 20 years later. When they did, there was something more than respect between them. There was a sense that they really understood each other. I mean, Shestov recognized in Husserl a man who lived for philosophy alone, for whom those stakes were all or nothing. And he was so grateful to Husserl for sending him to Kierkegaard. How was it, he says, that a man whose whole life had been a celebration of reason should have led me to Kierkegaard's Hymn of the Absurd? And yet, he says, there's this inner kinship between Husserl's teaching and that of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Because in absolutizing truth, Shestov says, Husserl was forced to relativize being, or more accurately, human life. And Shestov understood that Husserl's own life was his own Kierkegaardian wager, whose stakes were absolute. It was his own either or. He put us the choice with either we are all insane, or Socrates was poisoned is an eternal truth equally binding upon all conscious beings. For Shestov, this reign of the absolute reason was cruelty, and he would follow Kierkegaard, who sought truth not in reason, but in the absurd, and believed that philosophy would be good precisely where the possibilities of reason on that border had been exhausted. This was in the essay that I mentioned at the beginning, his memoir, Eulogy to the Great Philosopher, that he wrote right after Husserl's death in 1938. Shestov himself, when he finished this text, no longer had the strength to get out of bed. It was his last text. The galleys arrived from the publisher literally as he took his own last breath on November 20th, 1938. He was buried in Boulogne, and a rabbi recited Kaddish for Leiba Yitzhak Schwartzman. I want to just say a couple things about his soft-spokenness, I read a lot of his letters, I should say. So in addition to philosophical text, I'm a historian, and we do these voyeuristic things like read other people's letters. I've read a lot of Husserl's letters. I've read his correspondence with Husserl. I've read his correspondence with Spiet. I've read his correspondence with his family. There's a soft-spokenness, a self-reflectiveness, a total absence of arrogance, a kindness, a consideration for others, and at the same time, a radicalism, a insistence that philosophy has to go to the limits, that you have to ask the absolute questions, the Dostoevskian questions of how can this world be accepted? And if it can't be, then like Ivan Karamazov, do we return our entrance ticket? That famous line from the brothers Karamazov, where like, it's not God I don't accept, it's this world of gods, and that's why I want to return my ticket. And he says, Kierkegaard reproached the philosophers for not living in the categories in which they thought, but wouldn't it be more correct to reproach them for not having dared to think in the categories in which they lived? And I just want to say a couple things in the last minute or two, kind of about, maybe more personally, about what it means for me to come back to Shestov now, and look at this idea of border experiences and limit experiences. If you haven't seen the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol, you should all watch the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol, which won the Oscar. It is the most raw despair I've ever seen captured on film. It's the most unmediated glance at despair I've ever seen captured on film. And it's almost unbearable to watch, but for that reason, it should be watched. And when I saw it, I thought of the moment in, some of you may know Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas, ladies and gentlemen, the Auschwitz stories. And there's a moment in the beginning of those stories where a young woman is getting off a young Jewish woman, she's getting off the transport from Auschwitz. There's a little boy with her. You know, she doesn't want to be chosen for the gas chamber. She wants to be young and healthy and unencumbered. And so she's trying to walk very quickly and look very energetic. And there's this little child chasing after her, shouting, "Mamo, mamo, nie uciekaj," you know, "Mommy, mommy, you know, don't run away." And she denies the child because she wants to live, which I've always found to be perhaps the most unbearable moment, like in all of Holocaust literature. I used to teach that story, and when my son was born, I couldn't do it anymore. And 20 Days in Mariupol is like that. You're just in this case of raw despair, the despair that is absolutely singular in every case and can only be absolutely singular. Which is what Kierkegaard saw in Job, and which is what Shestov saw in Job. And this is the Grenzerfahrung. This is the Grenzsituation, that border experience. And that was the topic of the conversation I had with Volodya and Tanya 2 weeks ago at the Kiev School of Economics. And we talked about whether that moment of being in that border situation was epistemologically privileged. You know, what is going on now in Ukraine that precisely, you know, in these moments of great despair, that is when something philosophically essential is illuminated. And they talked about that this is the moment for them when the edge becomes the center, when the boundary, when the border becomes the center, you know, where truth is to be found precisely there. And I was staying in the neighborhood in Kiev, less than a mile from where Shestov grew up, kind of coincidentally. And I was on one of the last days I was there, you know, just in the 3 hours on a Thursday morning between 3 and 6 a.m. Yeah, I spent with my friend Amelia Glazer. I was there with, we spent not just the two of us, but in a bomb shelter, during which time the Russians sent 31 missiles just in those 3 hours, just to Kiev. And we stayed there through all 31 missiles as Ukrainian air defense actually shot down all 31 missiles. Although, as you might imagine, even when they do shoot down the missiles, there are still casualties because the pieces fall to the ground and then there are craters. That the Russians spent just in those 3 hours, $390 million just shelling civilian targets in Kiev for absolutely no reason, just trying to slaughter people for absolutely no reason. And I when we came out of that, it was when we came out of that bomb shelter, I went back to Shestov's essay and his writings from the First World War. And he writes to his sister, he said, "The events are so monumental that it's impossible to fathom their inner meaning now. And it will be impossible to afterwards." And I thought, will this be possible afterwards? Will there ever be any way to kind of articulate what these people are going through? And then when we got out that morning, I then asked, I asked a friend, Ukrainian Jewish publisher, Leonid Finberg, I'm sure some of you may know, to take me to the house where Shestov grew up. And that's the picture, the building in Podil in Kiev, where I was there with my Polish friend, Slavik Shirakowski and Leonid, like just hours after we left the bomb shelter. And I wanted to have us think about what it means for the edge to become the center, for the border zones to become the center of truth, the sense that I had too of being drawn there, being drawn precisely to that place, because that's when you feel like philosophy begins. And then I want to kind of end just with the thought that Shestov's desire not to obey, to rebel, it was a rebellion against rationalism, but it was not irrationalism in a nihilist sense. It was really very deeply humane. that he was very much a humanist, you know, in his way. And the desire was not to destroy. And his empathy for Job was so overwhelming because it was an empathy that really amounted to a great love. Thank you.